If you would, go ahead and find a seat, and we'll take it to the next level. And just a little plug. Again, remember reception afterwards, so I hope you're going to linger with that, carry on your networking, because we listened to you, we heard what you had to say, and of course part of the reason people come to these things is not just the educational value, it's the networking opportunity that it presents. So we appreciate everybody being here. Building in terms of on what you've already heard, I was thrilled in terms of being able to bring this next speaker to our region to talk a little bit about the perspective of the Manufacturing Institute. I heard his boss speak to a group when I was in D.C. not too long ago, and I approached her and asked her if she will. So Gardner knows he was actually the second person I invited to do this presentation. And the nice thing is he hasn't really been offended at all about that. He's a good guy. But I was really impressed in terms of the content, saw really how it fitted in really well with some of the other issues that we face locally, regionally, and certainly what it is that we're trying to do a little bit about it. They're a tremendous resource. So I've got the great pleasure of welcoming Mr. Gardner Carrick. He's the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Manufacturing Institute. I assume Gardner is going to tell you a little bit about that's associated with the National Association of Manufacturers, which is a very important organization in our book. Since we are a manufacturing region, we have to remind people of that from time to time. Two things I want to point out, draw to your attention. Again, I'm not going to read his bio, but two things in that. One is Gardner's involved in the Institute's efforts with the U.S. military to assist transitioning personnel. How relevant is that to Eastern North Carolina? And number two is he ran the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration. He was involved, he served in that as a project director for a $325 million initiative focused on talent development in 39 regions across the country. So if you would, join me in giving a great welcome to Mr. Gardner Carrick.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's actually my first time in this part of North Carolina, and I drove in from Raleigh this morning, and it's really a pretty drive and a beautiful part of the country. So it's a pleasure to have my first visit in this area. Before we get to this, and a lot of my presentation kind of builds off the first speaker, but I wanted to kind of get on something that Ted led his talk off with, which is one of my hobby horses is data sources and government data sources, and really the imperfection of those data sources and the resulting inadequate public policies that result from that. So he mentioned record profits, record stock market, et cetera. There's been this thing over the last 5 years called quantitative easing, which is really the Federal Reserve's approach of pumping dollars into the marketplace to try to prop up the economy. So that's had a pretty significant impact on the value of the currency that kind of happens below the radar. So if you look at things like the price of oil or the price of the S&P 500 in gold rather than in dollars, what you see is really a pretty flat market. Unfortunately, the dollars that get reported are ones that indicate record profits, and those that have a majority of their assets in equities benefit from that. Unfortunately, the average American doesn't have the majority of their assets in equities. They have them in their home, and the home prices have gone the other way. So one of the reasons that we haven't seen upward pressure on wages is, well, really two reasons. One, you have an unemployment rate that's 6.5% and an unofficial unemployment rate that's probably double that. And then secondly, the government's accounting of inflation is really pretty flawed, so that they bake into it Moore's Law, which is basically the better the computing power is, you're getting much more computer than you did 5 years ago. Therefore, that's a massive deflationary pressure on the overall rate. So rather than a 6, 8, or 10% rate that is probably more reflective of what you're paying for goods and services, you're getting reported 1.5 or 2%. So it's tough to go to your boss and say, I need a 10% raise when inflation's not showing that and there's a bunch of people on the street that would probably take your job at the same wage. So anyway, just an aside that tends to have a corrupting influence on the ability of policymakers to really respond accurately to the forces of the market. Anyway, as you heard, my name is Gardner Carrick. I am the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the Manufacturing Institute, and we are the non-lobbying side of the National Association of Manufacturers. They are the big business association lobbying group in town, and they focus on things like taxes and trade and regulations, and employ 125 people to get very smart on those issues and then lobby Capitol Hill on bills that impact manufacturers' ability to compete successfully in the global economy. The Manufacturing Institute is the non-lobbying side, and our charge is really around education and workforce development. And we like to think of ourselves as the authority on the attraction, qualification, and development of world-class manufacturing talent. So in kind of legal terms, we're actually the C3, the nonprofit, non-lobbying side, and they're the C6, the lobbying side. So you heard a little bit in both of the presentations on why manufacturing, and Dr. Harden touched on it with the multiplier effect, but manufacturing is really that industry that drives the economy more so than any other. It's responsible for R&D, exports, et cetera. And it's really reflected best in the multiplier effect. And Dr. Harden showed the jobs multiplier. This is really just the pure output multiplier, which is for every dollar of GDP, manufacturing generates $1.33 in additional output in other sectors. And that means the more you put in, you're getting a greater output in other sectors. So the more you invest, the better you do. I mean, it's one of only two that is actually like that in agriculture, because if you think of making an honest living, the only way to make a real honest living is to make something that somebody wants to buy from you. A lot of the rest of us do other things that kind of orbit around that, but those are the ones that are really creating value in an economy and really driving growth in a region, in a state, and across the nation. So every year we do a public perception survey. We go out and ask 1,000 Americans what they think about manufacturing and what they think about some economic policies and whether we're on the right track and all those things that you tend to read from polls. And one that we include is if you could create 1,000 jobs in your backyard, what sector would you want to create? Would you want to have those jobs created in? And number one answer for all 5 years has been manufacturing. That is the public's internalization of the multiplier effect. They may not know the economics or the mathematics behind how you reach it, but they know that you had a new car plant or a new whatever plant, they're making things in your backyard, and you're going to have tremendous growth in every other sector of the economy. So NAM loves this because they can go beat lawmakers over the head with that and say, everybody wants manufacturing. As we'll see later on, there's kind of a double-edged sword to this one. So everybody loves manufacturing, but everybody has kind of believed that manufacturing is dying. Right? We spent the last 20 years watching manufacturing jobs disappear, believing that everything first gets made in Japan, then it was going to get the big sucking sound to Mexico, and now everything's made in China. That's not entirely true, but if you look at the overall employment figures for manufacturing over a 75-year basis, it's not hard to understand why you might believe that, because the last 15 years were pretty brutal. North Carolina knows that better than most states because you guys were the home to textiles and furniture and were the world leaders in it, frankly, and, well, you see what happens there. However, since really the beginning of 2010, it's been a different story. And one that is really unique for anybody, probably anybody in this room that remembers, that has a memory of the growth of manufacturing jobs in this country. So we've seen 4 consecutive year-over-year growth in jobs in manufacturing for the first time since the early 60s. That is pretty impressive, and I think it indicates a number of things. One, there's the whole kind of call it the dead cat bounce, right? You drop it high enough, it's going to come back. But there's also this a real resurgence or renaissance in manufacturing happening in this country. And North Carolina, likewise, is experiencing something similar with recognizing that you've got probably a year's worth of kind of stagnant growth. Over the last 4 years, you've seen some pretty significant increase for what you've experienced from the 15 years before that. So the reason behind this, there's a number of them. And in the rush to China, there was this belief that if you went over there, you were going to save a ton of money because you could pay people $1 a day rather than $25 an hour to make things. And that was true for a long time over there. But there's really been some pretty strong upward pressure on wages in China. And you've read about the suicides and a lot of the headline things that are really about worker conditions there. To the point where wages are pushing around the 30% of U.S. figure, which is at the number that most economists think the advantage to moving over there becomes negligible. That's number one. Number two, you have transportation costs. It actually costs a lot of money and a lot of time to float things across the Pacific. When you were mass producing the same thing for any audience, it didn't really matter necessarily. But as we heard towards the era of mass customization, being able to get things quickly to market and being able to customize them to individuals is not really possible when you're working with a contract manufacturer overseas that makes things exactly the same way for exactly the same product. And then thirdly, for some of our more higher end manufacturers, there's frankly a significant risk to their intellectual property, particularly in China. The government over there does not have the same respect for contract law or IP law as the West does or as Japan does. So as those companies have seen their secrets stolen and copied and then sold by Chinese manufacturers, they've determined that perhaps the risk is greater than the reward to that. So those all are kind of happening in one sphere, but the biggest one, the one that's really driving the resurgence in manufacturing is this one. For those in the back of the room, what this is the world liquid natural gas prices at the end of last year. So in the United States, that's like 3.25, and in China, that's like 15.25. So energy costs are a significant input to basically every manufacturing process that we have. And the ability to save 4 or 5x on your energy costs in the United States is driving significant return to these shores and to Mexico as well for manufacturers. And the ones that are really benefiting the biggest are ones like chemicals, which is just a massive input of energy. And the number of new plants and new firms that you're seeing in the chemicals industry is really pretty remarkable. And when you look at the sector GDP and what specific sectors within manufacturing represent the whole, chemicals went from something like 14% to 18% over the last 2 years of the total of manufacturing. So, pretty exciting time really to be a part of manufacturing because for the first time in 2 or 3 generations, there's actually a belief and even a reality that manufacturing has a future in this country. It's coming back and it's an exciting time to be competing for those jobs. But there are a few things that really threaten that, and first and foremost is the need for a skilled workforce. So we also do a pretty regular survey on how manufacturers are doing in terms of finding employees, particularly those that we call skilled production. They used to be called blue-collar jobs. Now some people call them gold-collar. They're really the 2-year education level, 2-year university or community college and kind of that era. So you're not talking about calculus-based engineering. You're really talking about the men and women that make the machines run and that really operate the line. And 4 out of every 5 manufacturers are having trouble finding people with those skills. And you heard a little bit about why before, but the basic reason is that all of that bloodletting that went on in the 2000s was extremely painful and very, very unpleasant for individuals, for families, for communities, for states, and for this country. But it really was a unfortunate but necessary transformation that happened to the industry because we're now positioned, and you look at BCG's rank, up to number 2 in the world, to take advantage of what are the technologies that are really driving manufacturing. So we really did have to get as lean as possible, automate as much as possible, and to make things on a tremendously tight margin in order to compete with every other country in the world, because most other countries are looking at manufacturing first and foremost because of the multiplier effect. So every East Asian country is trying to attract manufacturing. So because of that, you really saw a significant change in who was what you needed to be successful in manufacturing. It wasn't just a strong back, it wasn't strong arms, it wasn't being able to do repetitive motions. It was really running, fixing, and programming the machines that are doing all of that now. Unfortunately, a lot of our programs that prepare individuals for manufacturing careers either got eliminated because manufacturing was dying or weren't keeping up with what the skills were at the time. So we just came out with a study last week in partnership with Accenture, kind of look at how manufacturers, what it's costing them in terms of real dollars, this skills gap, and then what they're doing to try to mitigate it. And what we found was that, you see the numbers, 55, 60, 70% of companies are having a pretty significant increase in things like overtime and downtime and in production cycle time. And when you kind of add all that up and do a little math on it, it comes out to around 11% potentially of bottom line earnings are impacted because you're not able to run at peak capacity because you can't find people to run those machines. So what are companies doing about it? They're spending something like $3,200 a head on new hires, trying to train them up to what they need to be successful. And they're spending around $1,500 per year on training existing employees. Unfortunately, manufacturers aren't very good at training. They used to be excellent at it. They had widespread apprenticeship programs that they sent new hires into for a couple years, and they really invested tremendously in this. But over the course of the last 25 years, that was one of those not core functions that got eliminated in favor of buying talent on the spot market. And they were able to successfully buy that talent on the spot market because we were laying off a third of the workforce over 10 years. Unfortunately now, fortunately, but unfortunately from a company perspective, everybody is growing now. So not only are you not seeing massive layoffs from manufacturers, you're actually seeing strong growth across the entire sector. So competing for those individuals has become more difficult. So what's the Manufacturing Institute doing about this? We have 3 goals that we're working on. And the first is to reestablish the U.S. as a leader in manufacturing education. When I was growing up, and this was in the 80s, there were still VOTEC programs at every high school where I grew up in Pennsylvania. Kids could spend half the day learning manufacturing arts or automotive or whatever they wanted. And Pennsylvania still has most of those programs, but you look at most other states, and that entire system has been eliminated, in part because the jobs didn't appear to be there, in part because that was for the dumb kids, and no parent has a dumb kid. So therefore, we're not going to invest in it, right? Everyone needs to go to college. So rather than trying to refight that battle and get individual school districts to reinvest, we decided to go to the community college system because community colleges were already picking up some of the slack from what the high schools left behind, A. B, there's only 1,200 of them as opposed to 12,000 high schools in the country. And C, they were willing to work with us because most community colleges have a great deal of autonomy. They're already designed to be responsive to employers to some degree, and they wanted to work with us. So what we did was, 5 years ago, we took a look at every piece of paper, credential, certification, certificate, that purported to indicate that someone had skills in manufacturing. And we applied a pretty rigorous filter to them to identify those that we considered best in class. And once we did, we endorsed them under the NAM banner and said, these are the ones that really individuals need to be successful for careers in manufacturing. So you're talking about things like the American Welding Society and the National Institute for Metalworking Skills and the green belts and black belts from ASQ. And some certifications are reasonably well used, others are not. And then we went to community colleges and said, if your welding program is not resulting in those students earning an American Welding Society certification, then you need to get your welding program up to snuff because that's the indicator of a baseline level of confidence that manufacturers need, and that's the call it the prestige that comes with earning an industry certification, much like you see in IT, where Oracle and Microsoft and Cisco have really attached a tremendous prestige to individuals earning those credentials. So we've seen pretty incredible growth on the technical side of our certifications, from something like 40,000 in 2010 to over 70,000 this past calendar year. So very, very strong growth in that, and over 200 schools that are now working with us. And actually, North Carolina has really been one of the model states for this. Forsyth Tech in Winston-Salem was one of the first schools that we went to do this. And then the State Community College office decided to do what they called a super SIP, a super curriculum improvement plan, that took this and took it to as many community colleges as were interested and said, you should be embedding NIMS certifications in your machining program and AWS certifications in your welding program so that we can prove to manufacturers that we are producing talent at a level that they need. So that is really our signature solution when it comes to elevating the education system in this country and really ensuring that they are teaching the skills that manufacturers need. What we decided was kind of try to get a little creative on this and begin to not just offer an endorsement of certifications, but begin to recognize those schools that are doing what we want. So we created an M list, basically an NAM endorsed community college school list, but the lawyers wouldn't let us call it that. So any schools that are actually offering these certifications as a standard part of their curriculum so that you earn them essentially as the final exam of the course, we're going to endorse you on the M list, list you on the M list. We're going to send out press releases saying you're doing a great job. And we're going to begin advertising in things like site selection and area development so that companies know what areas are actually able to produce the talent that they need. So we're making strides on this. The other thing that's kind of been happening or orbiting this is the U.S. Department of Labor has put thus far $1.5 billion and another $500 million coming out this year into community college programs through their TAA program. And roughly $250 million of that was directed specifically at manufacturing programs to do a lot of what we're talking about. So we've had the good fortune of having initial seed capital from foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then having the government pick up and really fund at a scale level the use of these certifications. So, all right, that's great. We've got programs that are up to industry standards and that can create a good training program to take the place of what were manufacturers' training programs. But it doesn't do us any good if nobody actually goes into those programs. And manufacturing has really suffered from an image problem for probably 2 generations now, and certainly 1 generation. And there was a lot of truth to what that image was, and that it was not a very desirable career. There were layoffs all the time, and you were probably going to be physically exhausted and prematurely disabled working in the industry if you weren't careful. That industry no longer exists, but that perception still lingers in a lot of people's minds. And in North Carolina, if you think about it, there are probably a lot of families that went through a lot of pain over the last 15 years in dealing with layoffs in the textile and furniture industry. The likelihood of them encouraging their son or daughter to enter manufacturing is probably less than what it may have been. So how do we kind of combat all of that? I said the flip side of that earlier one where 1,000 people want 1,000 jobs in manufacturing in their backyard is that when we asked them if they could start their careers over again today, what industry would they select? Manufacturing is at the bottom. So, and then only 3 out of 10 would actually encourage their kids to go into manufacturing. So what we're seeing is, yeah, we want the jobs, we want the industry, but for somebody else, not for me, not for my family, not for my loved ones. So that is a challenge, and one that unfortunately we don't have a $100 million campaign ad budget to deal with. So what we're left with is really kind of smaller scale efforts to raise the profile of manufacturing and to change the perception of what it is, what the industry actually is today. So the military one, you heard mention of my work on the military. The military is a very obvious place for us to recruit candidates from. There's something like 12 to 15% of individuals in the service are learning and doing manufacturing-related skills. If you're maintaining an aircraft or a tank or whatever, it's not that dissimilar from maintaining an assembly line. So how do we find those individuals and reach them while they're still in the service and encourage them to look at careers in manufacturing? We've been working very hard with the Defense Department and particularly with the U.S. Army to do exactly that. And it's tough sledding because individual bases control their own transition programs. There's not a lot of top-down command on this, so we really need to develop relationships base by base. which we have a staff of 10, so it's not the easiest thing in the world. Luckily, we have a bit of a benefactor in General Electric, who decided to kick off what's called the Get Skills to Work campaign, which was really about getting military personnel to look at manufacturing careers. And that includes both those individuals, those 10 to 15% that already have skills in manufacturing, but also appealing to the 85% that don't. So can we start up programs at community colleges that are more geared towards military personnel? They start at different times, they're more accelerated, they aren't just your more traditional education pathway that makes sense for someone just getting out of high school. Instead, they're tailored to someone that gets out in October and really needs to find a job pretty quickly. So can we get them a 12 or 15-week program that upskills them pretty quickly? So we've got a couple dozen schools that are working with us on this, and we're continuing to push that as well. Two other ones that I should mention. One is Step Ahead, which is our Women in Manufacturing Recognition Program. Manufacturers, we're looking at something like 75% male, which is obviously kind of a holdover from when you needed to have physical attributes to be successful in manufacturing. Today, that's basically not the case in almost every job. So that means that almost every job is really available to women if they choose to pursue it. Unfortunately, again, many of them still view manufacturing as not desirable in a male-dominated industry. So what we did was we decided to create a recognition program that highlights the contribution of women in manufacturing. Each of the last 2 years, we've recognized 100 and something women on their roles in manufacturing. Had a big dinner in D.C., invited their bosses and their CEOs, and really tried to get the commitments of senior management at manufacturers to prioritize looking at women. Then, at the same time, we tried to really make those women that we've honored ambassadors to other women in their communities. So can they go into high schools or even grade schools and be a role model for young girls that are thinking about what they want to do with their lives? So it has been a successful program, and that the energy that we've had around those events have been really tremendous. And the number of women that call our program coordinator on a weekly basis saying, "Oh, I'm going to this place, do you have materials that I can give out?" It's really been pretty tremendous, and frankly a surprise to me, because I was not convinced that this program was going to be successful. And then the final one up there is our Dream It, Do It program, which is really a grassroots effort to bring a network to a lot of those organizations that are focused on these things. So different places hold things like summer camps or ambassador programs or video competitions to showcase manufacturing, but they tend to be very regionally based, and not a lot of others know about them or know how to do them. So can we find those nuggets, those really interesting approaches to changing the perception of manufacturing, and highlight them and share them across others that are looking to do the same thing? So we've got 33 regions around the country that are working with us on this, and they really have some pretty interesting approaches to kind of doing retail level politicking almost to change the perception of manufacturing. And then the one big national event that we've done over the last couple of years is Manufacturing Day. First Friday in October, we decided that no one can be better at changing the perception of manufacturing than manufacturers themselves. If they would just open their doors and let people see the incredible technology, the cleanliness of the place, and really the cool stuff that's being made, you would begin to change the opinion of people in your community, and particularly the opinion of people like guidance counselors and teachers, and ones that really have an impact on whether or not a student's even allowed to consider manufacturing as a career. So last year we had 800 and something companies host plant tours of one form or another, and something like 30,000 people come through those plants, seeing what manufacturing in 2013 is really all about and what it's not all about. So we'll see how this year goes, but it was really one of those off-the-wall ideas that we had a couple of years ago, and said, why don't we just declare the first Friday in October Manufacturing Day and see what happens? And the response has really been pretty tremendous. So, the third one is that, as unfortunate as it is, the government does have a pretty significant impact on things like education policy, job training policy, and they put a lot of dollars behind it that will move the priorities of community colleges in others. So we need to have an ongoing debate and ongoing participation with those policymakers on what is important to manufacturers as it relates to the workforce. So NAM has a policy team that we work pretty closely with on their education side. And we're actually just hired a grad student yesterday to work on a paper for us this summer to look at what innovative state-level policies are out there to encourage the adoption of industry-based certifications in either high schools or community colleges. And the best one that I know off the top of my head is actually in Kansas, where the Kansas government, the state government, offers incentives of $1,000 a head to any high school for any kid that earns an industry-based certification. So rather than VOTEC being a cost center that pulls money away from the traditional high schools, it can end up being potentially a moneymaker if you're smart about what programs you offer and how many certifications you can provide. So it's that type of incentive to really adopt these industry credentials and to push the envelope on what it means to offer manufacturing education that I'm hoping to document and then publish so other states can see what's going on and maybe replicate that. So last thing, manufacturers are not absolved of blame in all of this. They have spent 15 years laying off workers and cutting programs and doing what they need to do to stay alive and stay competitive. But there are costs, there are ramifications to those actions, and a lot of what we're seeing as part of those ramifications. Some of that they can't change, but some things they can change. And one of them, what they can change, is how they actually go about looking for talent. They would never consider sourcing steel or rubber or any other raw material by any of these things. Yet they have no problem basically sourcing their most important asset, their human capital, by a word of mouth, or outsourcing it to somebody else, or posting an ad on a job board and just kind of hoping things come in. They're very deliberate about their supplier relationships for raw materials. So we're encouraging them to be as deliberate about their relationship for their talent supply chain as well. And when you look at the bottom there, the actual suppliers of talent are really the two bottom numbers there, tech schools and community colleges. And at the top are ones that are obviously not bearing fruit given the numbers that we saw earlier about the number of companies struggling to find workers. So if they can be smart about developing that relationship and re-engaging with community colleges, and too many of them, frankly, have had negative experiences in the past that have soured them on the education system. But it's time for them to take another look at what's happening in that education system and to be smart about how they engage. It doesn't mean serving on an advisory committee. It might just mean offering internships to the students, or it might mean agreeing to interview a couple that come out. But beginning to develop that relationship is really, I think, the other key component to really successfully building a talent supply chain. So that's what I have. There I am. There's my Twitter account. So it's an exciting time to be in manufacturing. When I first took this job in 2009, it was one of those, not sure this is a great idea, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then the last 5 years has just been incredible in terms of the energy and the excitement and the interest in the manufacturing sector. So it's a great time to be looking at manufacturing, and it's important that we capitalize on this momentum to really build something for the long term. So happy to take any questions or just move along in the program. Yes, sir.
Afternoon. My name is Bowie Holder. I'm with Manpower Staffing Company. I appreciate everything you were saying.
Manpower in the room.
Well, I had to take issue with the last comment, that the number 2, that 40%, and that wasn't working, And there's a lot of variables there, and just so everyone will know, we work strongly with tech schools and community colleges and are doing everything we can to strengthen those partnerships. And I think if my client base was here today, they would tell you very different that we're key, that we are key to the customized and flexible workforce that was mentioned by one of the other speakers. And so just wanted to mention that. I'd be willing to speak with anyone afterwards as to how I could help you personally. But no, that's, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. But just, the staffing agencies, we're doing our job, and we are providing that niche of that pain to find this workforce. It's the only thing that we do. what we do allows you to do what you do in running your business. We can help with that workforce.
So on that point, couple clarifications or issues on that. Number one, manufacturers are not very good at training, and they're not very good at HR. So finding people that are good at it actually makes sense, number one. Number two, back on the government data sources for a second. When you look at where manpower falls in that, manpower fills a tremendous number of jobs in manufacturing, but they're actually not in manufacturing. They're a service to a manufacturer. Therefore, all that job growth is not reflected in manufacturing. So it's really pretty hidden what you guys do for manufacturers. Number three, the downside to this is that people want jobs at the manufacturer, and they don't necessarily know to go to manpower. So how we handle that situation going forward is tricky. And I know manufacturers want call it a contingent labor force, the ability to not necessarily take on full-time employees, particularly as the costs continue to rise on all of the extraneous things that must go along with new employees. But that does not necessarily project the best image to individuals thinking about entering the career that you're contingent labor. So how we handle all those, I don't know the answer. And just as a final data point, Manpower is actually on my board. So I do have a tremendous amount of respect for what they do, regardless of my jibes at them from time to time. But they are a reality in what manufacturers are doing today. So how we work within that construct to present a better image and a better solution, I think, is important. Yeah, I'm halfway back. Yes, sir.
First off, thanks very much for your words about community colleges. I'm the president of Pitt Community College. One area that you did not mention, but probably you're fully aware of, is the work keys and career readiness certificate that the Eastern region has been so great at helping us provide for a variety of people in this area. That has been one of our fastest growing services, pre-hiring services for business and industry. And that not only serves well the manufacturers, but it also provides a network for the people who take that test and get online and can seek not only that specific job, but jobs later on. So, I know that, is that on ACT?
So the first one there, ACT.
Yeah, right.
Well, for those of you familiar with Department of Labor speak, they have these competency models that look like pyramids. And the bottom ones are things like basic workplace competencies and then your kind of core foundational skills. And ACT's National Career Readiness Certificate and their associated Work Keys training program really gets individuals prepared for those core foundational skills like math and reading and locating information. So we use that as kind of the foundational certification in our model because it really means that you're trainable. And if the high school diploma has become very inconsistent across counties, across school districts, across the country, and what it means. ACT gives us a more consistent level of skills that we know that someone can enter an accelerated welding program because they have the mathematics needed to really understand what's happening in welding. So
just one other thing. You were asking about best practices or initiatives. You may not be aware that Governor McCrory has proposed an additional funding increment for community colleges that are preparing students for a job in their community that is much, the mid-skills gap issue. If funded, that would be, I think, a special tier of funding that you don't normally see in other states. So I'd like to hope that that will become a best practice for other states to emulate.
yes, I would be interested to know more about that. Yes, sir.
Question, tax incentives, states are competing against other states with the same to attract the same manufacturers. Can you tell us a little bit about corporate tax rate, tax breaks, incentive packages, and how your perspective on that?
Sure. So there's actually a lot in that. First of all, on the national corporate tax rate, it's a problem that, for whatever reason, Congress just refuses to deal with. So you have all this money parked overseas, and and the territorial system and all sorts of things that are really detrimental to manufacturers reinvesting the money that they make overseas in the U.S. That's number one. Number two, individual regions use the economic development tools of tax incentives to really lure companies there. And I think they do it because everybody else does it and you feel like you have to. And I'm not opposed to that if that's what gets them there, but I feel like it's a little bit of a zero-sum game and a little bit of a, like that's not actually how they make their decisions. You go back and look at that list that Ted had up, and it really is things like availability of skilled workforce and infrastructure, and the tax incentives have been the tool that economic developers use the most. So we're going to pull that tool back out again. And it's not to say it doesn't matter, but you look at Toyota, right? They just left California for Texas. It wasn't because Texas offered them a total break on corporate taxes and on property taxes and everything else. They weren't really even courted. They made that decision to consolidate there for a number of other reasons that were important, not least because California's business climate is near the bottom of all those lists. So a larger, more consistent, more stable business environment that includes access to infrastructure, includes access to talent, and includes access to financing is more important than one-time shots of capital around tax incentives, in my opinion. Now, I am not the economic development professional on this, so I'm sure plenty of hands would go up in this room saying, I got these guys here because of this tax break, but it's my view that a longer-term look at attracting companies because you have the best region, not because I'll offer you breaks over the next 5 years, is a better approach long-term. In the back of the room.
Thomas, why don't you go ahead and ask yours in the end?
My question is, as I listen to you talk about the human capital and how the employees were treated in the manufacturing industry, and I'm a county commissioner, and probably 40% of our budget goes to human services, and so that's a huge concern. And one of the disadvantages when it comes to recruiting industry is bringing those that pay the living wage, as it has been explained to me now. And my question is, how do you see the minimum wage issue playing a part in attracting manufacturing in North Carolina?
Yeah, tricky issue. I mean, my macro picture on this is that the minimum wage almost doesn't matter to manufacturers because the jobs that are available in manufacturing today are more valuable than minimum wage jobs. Anybody that was earning a minimum wage job got automated out of existence. So in that regard, it doesn't matter because there are almost no minimum wage jobs in manufacturing. However, the minimum wage sets the scale for all wages above that. So if the minimum wage is $7.25 or whatever it is right now, then if you're making double minimum wage, you feel like, okay, you're doing all right, and 30 grand a year is okay in a lot of regions. If all of a sudden the minimum wage becomes $10 or $12 an hour, then 15 doesn't quite feel as good because you're almost at minimum wage, so now you want double that again. So it really is about sliding the pay scale up that I think manufacturers worry about more than actually the number of employees that they are paying minimum wage to and the increased labor costs in that. I think one other thing to note about manufacturing jobs is that a lot of policymakers and economists look at pay scales of entry level and say those jobs aren't worth investing in because it's $12 an hour, 14 or 15. The thing is that those are really the bottom level. Manufacturing has a pretty well-defined and clear career path. As long as you continue to gain skills, you're going to move up pretty quickly. You're not going to be a $12 broom sweeper or forklift operator or button pusher for your entire career. It's not like kind of the GM model where you come in at 30 and you stay at 30 for 30 years. Focusing on what you can actually earn over a 10 or 15-year period and what you can make as you advance in your career, I think is important, and not getting hung up on, well, those are just $12 or $14 an hour jobs. So I know it's not exactly what you're asking, but overall, I don't think minimum wage is directly an issue. I think it becomes an issue in the overall pay scale structure. Yeah, the back of the room.
Thank you. My name is Martin Crompton. I work for a company called WST Industries. My question is, it basically encompasses what you've been talking about today. You kicked off by saying around about 82% of manufacturers are looking for skilled workers. My understanding is that number's around about 600,000 currently. That could go as high as 3 million in the next 2 to 3 years. You combine that with what you also touched on, which was trustfully, this trickle of onshoring, which could turn into more of a flood in the next few years because of all the dynamics you mentioned. You've also got the likes of Walmart saying they want to bring $50 billion worth of their trade to the shores and stimulate another tenfold. So that's $500 billion. Your third goal is advocate for better education and job training policies with the government. What I'm looking at now, surely politicians are looking to do two main things: drive jobs and balance the trade deficit, both of which get them elected. We've had a lot of talk coming out of Congress in the last year about public-private partnerships. What can we do collectively, manufacturers in the area, specifically in North Carolina, with the organizations like John? And I know John's doing a lot of great work with NC Eastern Alliance and STEM East, particularly with Steve Hill. I'm sure he's going to talk about this. How can we actually stimulate that, get politicians to open their minds to be facilitators of this change rather than obstacles we have to climb over?
Yeah, I think the best advice would be don't focus at the federal level, focus at the state and even at your local level. So education is entirely a local issue. Your community colleges are basically entirely run by their presidents, or sometimes they report up to the chancellor at the state level, but the feds essentially have no oversight responsibility of community colleges. High schools are run entirely by local school boards with a little bit of kind of oversight from the state. So your ability to actually work with people in your community to make some significant changes to things is, I think, right in front of you. Workforce investment boards, the DOL-funded job training system, is supposed to be run by community leaders and business leaders. Now, it hasn't always worked that way, but it doesn't mean that it can't work that way. It just takes a little bit of discipline to go in there and say, we're going to prioritize our training dollars around manufacturing careers for the next year because we see these jobs coming in and we want to help fill them. So manufacturers have been kind of drilled into their head that their priority is to focus on product, right? And that's why they got in the business in the first place, was because they're good at making product and putting it on trucks. They're not good at playing politics. They're not good at sitting on curriculum improvement program boards. And they don't want to spend their time that way. But collectively, kind of speaking with a voice that can be heard at the local community, and somebody needing to volunteer to do some of that dirty work is required. So I know that's not a great example or a great answer. You'd much rather say, write your congressman and they'll listen. But we know that's not really the case. So anyway, thank you. It was a real pleasure to be here today. And I'm glad I got the opportunity to come down to Eastern North Carolina.
Thanks very much, Gardner.